Hey guys, in today's video, we'll be going over how to frame for a sliding glass door in our view series when attaching to a bulkhead. This will apply to floor to ceiling applications. Before getting started, I want to go over the main framing components for this application. The first framing component is our view wall start. Throughout the video, I'll be referencing two sides of the view wall start. There'll be the glass side and there'll be the stud side. The next framing component is our view guide. The view guide is used to attach directly to the ceiling and directly to the floor. The next framing component is our view track, also referred to as the arrowhead due to its shape. The view track sits directly on top of the view guide. In between the view track and the view guide, to level the view track, we use a leveling bolt. The leveling bolt will slide directly into the center of the view guide. The next framing component is the finish cover. The finish cover is used to finish the stud side of the view wall start. And the last framing component is our view L bracket. So with the framing components covered, we'll go ahead and get started. With the bulkhead as my ceiling type, we'll start with measuring for our view wall starts. The view wall starts will be used as your vertical framing only. To measure for your view wall starts, you'll measure from the floor to the ceiling. So I'll take my measurements on each side of the opening and we'll get the wall starts cut. As mentioned, the wall start has two sides. To determine the direction of the wall start, take a look at the drawing. On the door opening side, you want the stud side of the wall start facing towards the door opening. The reason being is because we'll put the finish cover on the wall start so the door can slide into it. On the fixed pane side, you'll want the glass side of the wall start facing out towards the glass. The reason being is the glass will slide into the center of the wall start. Starting on the door opening side of the opening, place the wall start against the wall with the stud side facing out towards the center of the door opening. This would also apply to door openings coming off of flex posts or in the center of a run. Before attaching the wall start, it is extremely important to make sure it is perfectly plumb. If you're coming off an existing wall and the wall is out of plumb, you need to make sure to plumb up the wall start. If this creates a gap between the wall start and the wall, you'll need to come up with a way to fill the gap. We do not offer anything to fill this gap. The reason we want the wall start to be perfectly plumb is because the door will be shutting into the wall start. Therefore, we want a nice even gap at the top and at the bottom between the wall start and the door. When attaching the wall start to the wall, you'll need to use a screw long enough to go through the wall start and into the wall. We do not provide the external attaching hardware with our product. For this situation, I'll be using a 2.5-inch framing screw. You'll need to run 3 or 4 attaching screws per vertical wall start. When attaching the wall start to the wall, run the screw through the center of the wall start. On the glass side of the opening, place the wall start against the wall with the glass side of the wall start facing towards the center of the opening. Before attaching, make sure the wall start is perfectly plumb. When attaching the wall start to the wall, use a screw long enough to go through the center of the wall start and into the wall. Again, we're going to run 3 to 4 attaching screws. With the wall starts installed, I can now measure for the view tracking guide attaching to the ceiling. The measurement will be from wall start to wall start. When you receive the view tracking guide, they'll be wrapped together. And in this situation, you can actually cut the view tracking guide together because they'll be the same length. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and cut my view tracking guide. Before attaching the view guide and view track to the ceiling, we can install our finish cover on the door opening side of the opening. To measure for the finish cover, measure from floor to ceiling. I'll take my finish cover measurement and I'll get it cut. Before installing the finish cover on the wall start, test fit the finish cover to make sure it fits properly. With this design of the finish cover, once it's installed on the wall start, it cannot be removed without damaging the finish cover. So place the finish cover on the center of the wall start. Then, using your rubber mallet, strike the center of the finish cover to install it on the wall start. There should be a nice flush finish between the wall start and the finish cover. With the wall starts installed, we can now attach the view guide to the ceiling. Before installing the view guide to the ceiling, we'll need to prep the view guide to allow the anchoring screws to go through the view guide and into the ceiling. How the view guide is prepped will be dependent on the type of anchoring screw being used. In this case, I'll be using one of our self-tapping screws. Therefore, I'll need to use a step bit to create a hole large enough to use my other bit to run the screw through the guide and into the ceiling. When determining the hole locations for the attaching screws, we like to run at least 3 attaching screws within the entirety of the door opening. The entirety of the door opening will be approximately 76 inches. Therefore, we'll run an anchoring screw about 4 inches, another at 36, and then another at 72. From there, you can run the attaching screws approximately every 4 feet. Before drilling the holes out for the attaching screws, you'll need to slide in the leveling bolts. The square nut on the leveling bolt will slide into the channel of the view guide. To determine the location of the leveling bolt for sliding door applications, you'll need to place the first leveling bolt 40 inches in from the end of the view guide. We do not want a leveling bolt within the walk-through door opening. The reason we do this will be discussed later on in this video. Once you have your first leveling bolt in place, you can then run the leveling bolts every 3 feet. I'll now prep the track guide to attach it to the ceiling. I've went ahead and attached the view guide to the ceiling. When attaching the view guide to the ceiling, you'll need to flush up one edge of the view guide with the outside edge of the wall start. You'll need to also do this on the other end of the opening. You can also align the center of the view guide with the center of the wall start. Now you'll notice that I didn't use any L brackets when connecting the wall start to the view guide. For bulkhead applications, the bulkhead's strong enough, therefore we don't need to rely on the strength of those L brackets to hold the view guide in place. Therefore, all you'll need to do is align that view guide with the wall starts properly. With our view guide installed, we can now set the position of the leveling bolts. As mentioned earlier, the purpose of the leveling bolts and the view guide is to level the view track. This will apply for both the ceiling and the floor. So for example, if for whatever reason you have a ceiling that's out of level, you simply just adjust the leveling bolts to ensure the view track is perfectly level. Now, when you have sliding door applications, it is extremely important that you maintain a minimum 3/8 of an inch air gap between the view guide and the top edge of the view track. If that air gap is not there, your door will potentially rub on that view guide. When setting the adjustment for the leveling bolt, start with the door opening side. Again, we want to have a minimum 3/8 inch air gap at the beginning of the door opening. If that air gap starts to grow throughout that door opening, that is perfectly okay as long as the view track remains level. To set the 3/8 inch air gap, take your tape measure and measure 3/8 of an inch from this point on the view guide down to the head of the screw. With this 3/8 inch air gap, it'll create the 3/8 air gap between the view guide and the view track. So for this situation, I'm going to set my first leveling bolt at 3/8 of an inch. From there, I'll use my laser level to set the remaining leveling bolt so that it is perfectly level with my first leveling bolt. I set my first leveling bolt for the 3/8 inch gap. I can then take my tape measure and see where the laser is hitting the tape measure to determine what the bolts need to be at to be perfectly level. So with that measurement, I can now set the two other leveling bolts. Before moving on, I want to go over a situation you could run into when setting the leveling bolts. If for whatever reason you get a tighter air gap on this end of the opening, all you'll need to do is come back to the beginning of the door opening and create a larger air gap. Again, you want to maintain a minimum 3/8 inch air gap. So if you have to create a larger air gap on this end to get your 3/8 inch air gap down here, that is perfectly fine. Again, the main thing is to keep that view track perfectly level. So with that in mind, we can now move on to prepping and installing our view track. The view track will attach to the view guide using 4-inch framing screws. The view track will need to be prepped by drilling 1/4-inch holes at predetermined hole locations. To determine the hole locations, take a look at the view guide attached to the ceiling. The hole locations in the track will need to avoid the holes where the attaching screws and the leveling bolts are located in the view guide. To do this, all you'll need to do is take a tape measure to locate each hole locations and then mark your view track to pre-drill the holes. We'll be pre-drilling a hole approximately 6 inches off the end of the track. This plays into why we did not run a leveling bolt within the door opening. The 4-inch screw is going to act as a leveling bolt for this end of the track. The reason we do this is because when you hang the door, the weight of the door could pull down on the track. So we'll use the 4-inch screw to tighten or loosen the track to allow there to be a nice tight fit between the door and the wall start from top to bottom. To attach the view track to the view guide, use the 4-inch framing screw through the pre-drilled holes in the view track. Tighten the view track so that it is snug to the leveling bolt. In the door opening where we do not have the leveling bolt, run the 4-inch screw so that it creates a nice even gap across the opening. I'll go ahead and run my remaining framing screws. Before moving on to the floor track, I want to go over a situation when we have to splice the view track and the view guide within an opening. This would take place when you had longer fronts or double door openings. We never want to splice the view track within the door opening. So for example, if I had a 15-foot front here with a sliding door on this end, I would run my 10-foot track within the door opening and then a 5-foot splice on the other end. Now, with the view guide, we can run our 5-foot piece on this end and splice the 10-foot piece on the other end. The reason we would do this is to eliminate the hinge point between the view track and the view guide. Now, when you have double door openings, you'll need to make sure that the view guide is stretching across the door opening location. On double doors, a view track will be spliced together at the center of the door opening with the 10-foot runs or whatever length is away from the center of the opening. So again, to eliminate that hinge point, we don't want to splice the view guide in the center of that door opening. We only want to splice the view track. So with that in mind, we're going to move on to our floor track. To measure for the floor track, you need to establish the door opening width. To determine the door opening width, take a look at the drawing. Majority of the time, the measurement is going to be 3'2" or 38 inches. To measure for the door opening, measure from the finish cover over to 38 inches. With my door opening width marked, I can now measure for my floor track. To measure for the floor track, you measure from the wall start over to the door opening mark. With a floor track measurement, I can now cut my floor track. As shown in the clip before this, the view track and view guide can be cut to the same length for the floor. To prep the view guide for installation, first slide in your leveling bolts. Again, we want to run the leveling bolts about every 3 feet. We also like to have a leveling bolt on each end of the view guide. Once you have the leveling bolts in place, you can then place the view guide in the predetermined layout lines, and you also want to make sure the center of the view guide is in line with the center of the wall start. To prep the view guide for your attaching screw, it's going to be dependent on the type of anchoring screw you're going to use. For the ceiling guide, we had to use a step bit to drill out a hole large enough to run the attaching screw. For the floor guide, I'm actually just going to use a standard screw with a Phillips head. And with that, I can use a longer Phillips head bit, and it'll go directly in between the view guide to allow my attaching screw to run to the floor. You'll need to run your anchoring screws approximately every 4 feet. I'm going to go ahead and run my attaching screws in the view guide. With the view guide attached to the floor, I can now set the adjustment for the leveling bolts. Same as the ceiling, we want to start with the leveling bolt on the door opening side. We need to have that minimum 3/8 of an inch air gap between the view guide and the view track. Therefore, I'm going to set my first leveling bolt with the 3/8 inch gap. From there, I've set up my laser so I can level the other leveling bolts based on the first leveling bolt. The main purpose is to make sure the view track is perfectly level. To install the view track, place it on top of the leveling bolts in the view guide. Make sure the view track is nice and tight to the wall start. We do not attach the view track to the view guide. We let gravity hold it on top of the view guide. With the view track installed, the installation of the floor track is complete. To finish the exposed end of the view track and guide, we send our view end cap kit. The kit includes the view end cap, which will cap over the end of the view track and the view guide, the molly that will slide into the view track, and the attaching screw that will go through the view end cap and into the molly to attach it to the view track. The view end cap does not come pre-cut. You'll need to set the height of the view end cap based on the height of the view track. To do this, take the view end cap and turn it upside down so the arrowhead shape is towards the floor. Butt it up against the view track and guide and mark the top of the view track on the back side of the view end cap. Once you have that marked, take a straight edge and mark all the way across the view end cap. From there, you can cut the view end cap using a pair of tin snips. With the view end cap cut to size, you can now slide the molly into the small groove on the view track. You'll need to make sure to slide the molly in so that it is a tight fit. If it's in a direction where it is loose, just turn it until it has a nice tight fit. With the molly in place, I can now place the view end cap so that the countersunk side is facing away from the view track. Then take your 1-inch attaching screw to attach the view end cap to the molly. With the screw in place, the end cap has been installed. To finish up the framing, we're going to install the view saddle. The view saddle will slide into the center groove of the view track and attach directly to the finish cover. The purpose of the view saddle is to keep the view track from twisting when the door is hung. Sometimes when the door is hung, it'll cause the view track to twist. The view saddle will eliminate the twisting of the view track. Before attaching the view saddle, you need to make sure the view track is perfectly level and you have the minimum 3/8 inch air gap across the entire opening. The view saddle is going to snug up against the view track. It is not going to push up on it. Again, the purpose of it is to eliminate the twisting. So once you have your view saddle in place, take a 5/32 drill bit and drill through the pre-drill holes in the view saddle. With one hole started, go ahead and run one of the attaching screws. With one attaching screw in place, go ahead and drill the other hole and run the other attaching screw. Screws in place, the view saddle has been installed. Before concluding, I wanted to go over the major points discussed throughout this video. The first is making sure you have that minimum 3/8 inch air gap between the view guide and the view track. This air gap is extremely important to allow the sliding doors to operate properly. The other point is making sure the openings are plumb and square. Make sure you plumb up your wall starts on each side of the wall and make sure your view track is level on both the floor and the ceiling. This will be important when you go to measure for your glass. You want all your glass pieces to be as square as possible. So with that said, this will conclude the video. If you have any questions, please contact our office.